What is the relevance of the Ignatian spirituality to our times? The 500-year-old Ignatian spirituality, based primarily on 4 sources, namely the spiritual exercises of St Ignatius of Loyola, the constitutions of the Society of Jesus, the Autobiography, the memoir of St Ignatius, and the numerous letters St Ignatius wrote to Jesuits and others. But out of these 4 sources, we have a treasure trove of spiritual insights, spiritual messages, spiritual directions. In short, the Ignatian spirituality presents a way of life rooted in God, more suited to our times than his own. We shall now enlist 10 ways how the Ignatian spirituality is relevant to our times. Number 1. Ignatian spirituality is an invitation to a new way of life founded on God. God is the center of our lives. God is the one who is moving and taking us forward in life. Therefore, Ignatian spirituality helps us to prepare ourselves and to dispose whatever would take us away from God, and it helps us to seek and find God's will for us. It helps us to find how God is working in our lives, how God is laboring for us, how God is caring for us. And that's why annotation number 1 talks about the purpose of our life as to seek and finding God's will for us, and thus what Ignatius would call save our souls. Secondly, Ignatian spirituality is an invitation to greater abundance in life. Jesus had said, I have come to give life in its abundance. John chapter 10 verse 10. And therefore, Ignatian spirituality invites us to experience this abundance of God's gifts, God's graces lavished on us freely. And it is from this realization of more and more graces, to recognize more and more the love God has for us, we have the concept of magis. Number 3 is an invitation to pause and take stock of things in life. Ignatius has given us a beautiful tool for stock taking each day: the examination of conscience, or the examination of consciousness, in short, the examine. It is a 5-stage process of stock taking spiritually to find how God has been operative in my day-to-day life. Where do I find God's footprints in my life? And this awareness could lead us to greater peace and serenity in life. Number 4, Ignatius has always wanted to help souls. help people who were spiritually in need of his help. And this is one of the primary reasons why he began to undertake studies and become a priest and founding the Society of Jesus. The primary aim was to help people. And it is out of this concern for helping others that Father Pedro Arupe, former Superior General of the Society of Jesus, had invited all Jesuit collaborators involved in the field of education to mold people who would be men and women for others, who would be reaching out to others. Fifthly, St. Ignatius presents to us how we can recognize God present and operative in our lives, in our busy schedules, in our chaotic, routine infested schedules, through the contemplation in action. God is constantly laboring for us, and he continues to shower his blessings on us, and he is present even in our most troublesome times, in our most busy schedules. Ignatian spirituality helps us to find God in our work, in whatever we are engaged in. Sixthly, Ignatian spirituality invites us to greater freedom in life. Annotation 1 talks about the disordered affections or the inordinate attachments which bind us, which curtail our freedom. And once we prepare our souls and dispose of these disordinate affections, we experience greater freedom to submit ourselves to God's will, seek and find what He wants in our lives. 7. Ignatian spirituality helps us to find God even in our suffering, in our pain, in our loss, in our privation, in whatever which troubles us. The principle and foundation, number 23 of the spiritual exercises, talks about how we can find God even in our sickness, in our poverty, and in short life. So, it is not that we can find God only in our joys, in our health, in plenty and in long life, but also in the others, which we generally think are far removed from God's presence. 8. Ignatian spirituality is an invitation to greater surrender to God's will for us. God has a plan for each one of us. Jeremiah chapter 29 verse 11 talks about God's great plans for our welfare and not for our downfall. And in order to recognize God's plan for us, we need to submit ourselves to His plan, to His will for us. One of the most profound and popular prayers of St. Ignatius is the Suscipe, take and receive prayer, where we surrender our will, our liberty, our mind and understanding, and seeking God's grace that we may experience His love. Ninth, Ignatian spirituality is an invitation to savor, to relish God's love for us as revealed in the incarnation of Jesus Christ. In the grace for the second week, St. Ignatius invites us to seek the grace of an interior knowledge of the one who became man for me, that I may love Him ever more dearly and follow Him ever more closely. So it is an invitation to savor the love of God for us in and through Jesus. And tenth, the Ignatian spirituality is an invitation to seek and find what God wants of me in the crucial moments of my life. We all of us struggle with decision making. Ignatius presents a method of election by which we use our mental faculties in order to recognize how God is moving us towards an option which is more in conformity to His will. Once we follow this process, we can be sure that God wants of me this and not that. Thus we see this Ignatian spirituality, though 500-year-old, is so very relevant to our times, to our generation. If only we take time to enter into the mind of St. Ignatius of Loyola, then we will find greater spiritual resources, spiritual insights which can truly guide us towards seeking and finding God's will, to greater peace and serenity in our life.